So far, we've been talking about some of the skills that detectives use in courtrooms just like this to investigate cases, to make cases in front of juries. But we haven't yet really employed some of these into the examination of the Bible, of the New Testament, of the claims of the gospel authors. That's what we're going to do starting now. As a matter of fact, I've held out one of those tools to be used in a future session, the chain of custody, if you saw it in Cold Case Christianity. Now let's see how these tools, all 10, can be employed to make the case. Remember, I told you that the reliability of eyewitnesses comes down to 4 factors. Were they really there? Can they be corroborated in some way? Have they been honest and accurate over time? And finally, do they have a bias? Let's take that template for eyewitness reliability over the next few sessions and apply it to the authors of the Gospels specifically to see if they can be trusted. The first step is determining, were they really there? Were they present at the time of Jesus' ministry? Here's why I say that. If you want to lie about Jesus, there's an easy way to do it. Wait till everyone who knew the truth about Jesus is dead. Then you can write about anything you want. There won't be anybody who would know if it's true or not. So it turns out, if the Gospels are not dated early enough to have been written either by true eyewitnesses or by the people who knew those eyewitnesses, or at least at a time when people who would know if they were lying would know, then you can't trust them as eyewitness accounts. Look, there are claims that skeptics make that the Gospels are written so late in history, they were written by people who didn't know Jesus personally, written so late they couldn't be cross-checked by the fact finders, right, the people who would actually know if they were lying. Is that true? Are the Gospels written that late in history? If they are, they can't be trusted, at least not as eyewitness accounts, because they cannot have been written by eyewitnesses. Those folks would have been dead for hundreds of years. So how do we know how early they were written? Take a look at your participants guide. I've given you a timeline that I think will help us identify how early the Gospels were written. Here's how it's going to start. You'll notice in the book of Acts, written by Luke, that Luke never mentions the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. Why wouldn't he mention it? It's predicted by Jesus, right? At least if you included this detail, it would make Jesus appear to be an accurate predictor. Yet Luke never mentions the destruction of the temple. And in fact, he never mentions the siege of Jerusalem. Look, he got a lot of readers who were in the Jerusalem area who are reading this manuscript. Wouldn't you want to include the most significant event in the history of Jerusalem in the first century? Nope, it's missing. Why wouldn't Luke include those missing elements, the destruction of the temple, the siege of Jerusalem? Why not? As a matter of fact, in the book of Acts, he doesn't even describe how Paul dies. If you remember, Paul's still alive in the final chapters of the book of Acts. Well, we know about when Paul died, between 64 and 67. These are dates we know in history. Why wouldn't Luke describe the death of Paul, or the death of Peter, or the death of James, the brother of Jesus? These are the 3 most important people in his text, yet he never mentions how they die. Don't you think he would, given he mentions the death of Stephen? He mentions the death of James, the brother of John. He died in 44. Why would you not mention the death of the 3 most important people if you're mentioning the minor people? Well, there's one reasonable inference you might make from that. You can't talk about these things if they haven't occurred yet. If Luke is writing the book of Acts before the death of James, Peter, or Paul, or before the siege of Jerusalem, or before the destruction of the temple, that might explain why these things are missing from his event, from his chronology. So let's just tentatively date the book of Acts just 1 year before the first missing event. That puts it right around 60 A.D. Now, we know he writes 2 books. He writes the Gospel of Luke in addition to the book of Acts. And Luke, it turns out, he writes earlier. We know that because he tells us this in the first lines of the book of Acts. He says that in his former book, he wrote about everything that Jesus began to do and teach before he ascended into heaven. So now we have to date the Gospel of Luke prior to 60 A.D. because he wrote that book first. How early should we date it? Well, there are some internal clues that might give you a way of dating it. For example, in 1 Timothy, Paul, writing to Timothy in chapter 5, mentions that you should take care of the people who are serving in your church. They deserve to be compensated for their work. He says to Timothy, I know this is true because my Bible tells me so. In essence, he says, the Scripture says this. Really? So wouldn't you like to know what Paul is using as his Scripture? As early as the date in which he's writing to Timothy, which is in the 60s, wouldn't you like to know what it is he's using as his Bible? He tells you. He quotes 2 lines. He quotes a line, which I'll show you in the participant's guide, from Deuteronomy, Old Testament verse. Then he quotes a verse from the Gospel of Luke. The worker deserves his wages. He calls it Scripture. He's quoting Luke's gospel early in history, and he's calling it Scripture, but it gets better than that. When he writes to the Corinthian church, describing for them how they should do the Lord's Supper, he also cites Luke's gospel. Only this is a very early document. The letter to the Corinthian church is in the early 50s. And he's already citing Luke's gospel as authoritative when it describes the Lord's Supper. There are good reasons to believe that Luke's gospel is written early, available to Paul. He's using it, in fact, to teach local congregations and to teach Timothy. Now, that puts us in the 50s for Luke's gospel. And what's really interesting is I told you before, we have to hang on every word, right? That's a principle we've been using. Take a look at the first chapter of Luke's gospel in your participants guide. You'll see there are 3 alternative words. There are 3 optional words I've circled for you. Those 3 words are interesting to me. The most interesting of which is that Luke says he's not an eyewitness to the Gospel of Luke elements. He was an eyewitness during the time of the book of Acts. As a matter of fact, he even slips into first person at several places in the book of Acts. But he tells us in the first chapter of Luke that he was interviewing those who were eyewitnesses, who had seen Jesus personally. And he says in that first chapter, as you see in that first couple of lines, I've circled it, that he is creating an orderly account. The Greek word for orderly there simply means an account that's in the correct chronological order. Now think about that for a second. If you're writing an account about the life of Jesus, a history about Jesus, do you really need to tell me that it's in the correct chronological order? Don't I assume that an account that starts with the birth of Jesus and ends with the ascension of Jesus into heaven is in the correct order in between? Why would he feel compelled to tell us that it's in the correct chronological order? That's a word we should pay attention to. Why? Well, Papias, if you remember, we talked about Papias, that early bishop in church history, the one who said that Mark's gospel was written at the feet of Peter. Well, Papias also tells us something else about Mark's gospel. Papias said that Mark's gospel was accurate, if not orderly, and he uses the same Greek word. In other words, Luke might be telling us something about his account. He's telling us it's in the correct chronological order because there's another early account out there called the Gospel of Mark that's not necessarily in the correct chronological order. And as a matter of fact, who do you think he quotes word for word more than any other source? Luke quotes Mark. Only now he's got these pieces in the correct chronological order. But that means that Mark's account was written prior to Luke. And he's using it to assemble his account. Think about that. Now we've got an account called the Gospel of Mark that is well within the lifetime of potential eyewitnesses. It's well within the lifetime of people who would have even known if Jesus was described accurately in that gospel. We've got an account that we can work backwards using the timeline that I just showed you. As a matter of fact, in criminal work, we typically use timelines to determine if a suspect is available to commit a crime. Here we've used our timeline to determine if the writer is early enough to have written this time, to have written this account. And sure enough, it's early enough in history to have been written by somebody who was either there or had access to the people who were there and could be cross-checked by those who knew better. This doesn't mean it's true, but I've given you another tool for your tool bag, right? I've given you your call-out bag. I've given you a way to assess the dating of the Gospels, to know if they pass the first test, and they do.